Election on Thursday is within grasp. Labour have turned their attack in the final days of the campaign on the Prime Minister, calling him weak and incompetent.
The Conservative candidate had a letter of support from Lady Thatcher today, who's more popular here than the current leader. The message from voters is becoming repetitive.
The government have not done a good enough job, and they need to be taught a lesson.
Candidate and cabinet ministers are forced to deny that Mr Major is now an electoral liability.
Respect, which still remains for him, I find, and warmth, which still remains for him, will, I think, make him a very, very formidable asset to our party again, as he still is.
At campaign headquarters, the Liberal Democrats say it's not yet in the bag, but they've already ordered the champagne. They've highlighted the problems facing the country and say Mr Major's not the man to deal with them.
I don't believe at a moment of such important challenge it is good for the country to be ruled by a Prime Minister whose leadership qualities seem to me to be defective, and a government which is run by a political party which is at war with itself.
There'll be no champagne for Labour, but they're happy enough to join in the assault on the Prime Minister, even if a fresh face at the top would make life tougher for the opposition.
You're suggesting to me that because it might be in the interests of the Labour Party, I should want Britain to keep a Prime Minister who is weak, who is incompetent, who is simply not up to the job. It might be in the interests of the Labour Party, but it is not in the interests of Britain. And I repeat, the sooner he goes, the better.
Voters here often say they like Mr Major, they just don't think he's a real leader. Weeks before a date was even set for this by-election, Conservative Central Office were dismissing suggestions that it would be seen as a referendum on John Major's leadership. Now it seems the opposition parties want to turn it into exactly that. Mark Mardell, BBC News, Christchurch.
The Christchurch by-election will be held on Thursday. In all, 14 candidates will contest the seat. It became vacant in May with the death of the Conservative MP Robert Adley. He held the seat at last year's general election with a majority of 23,000. Well, joining me now from Christchurch is our political editor, Robin Oakley. Robin, have the Conservatives effectively written Christchurch off despite their huge majority?
Well, they haven't quite written it off, but they are in a sense going through the motions here. The body language of electors talking to the Tory candidate, the way in which the Liberal Democrats are trying to restrain their own exuberance tells its own story. It's only a matter, most people here are certain, of the actual extent of the Liberal Democrat majority, and the government have been wise to discount it in advance so much that it won't be quite the blow that would normally be expected when a seat with a 23,000 majority falls.
Labour's tactic appears to be that John Major's unguarded remarks about his colleagues show him to be weak and incompetent. Is that the way the voters regard it?
Not really the way I've found it on the doorsteps here. Labour are, of course, going for Mr Major's leadership because the Maastricht battle is dying away, and this is the best way they can destabilise the Tories. But people aren't really upset by Mr Major's rougher language. Indeed, someone I met said he really ought to do rather more of that in public. And as for the question of cabinet unity, well, back in Lady Thatcher's days, there was the old apocryphal story of her dinner for the cabinet, and the waiter said, "What will you have, madam?" And she said, "I'll have steak." And he said, "And the vegetables?" And she said, "They'll have steak too." But of course, real life isn't quite like that. Cabinets are not as malleable as that. They are collections of individuals, and they have differences. It's only when you get departures and serious splits that it really matters, and John Major runs a happier cabinet than most.
But outside the cabinet, Robin, doesn't what the Tories in Torbay were just saying show that the party is split right down to the grassroots over Europe?
Oh, indeed. There is an enduring problem for the Tories over Europe, and earlier on, when the Conservatives were facing an earlier key vote on Maastricht, they tried to get constituency associations to put pressure on a lot of the rebels to come into line, and it simply didn't work. There's not a great lot of enthusiasm for Maastricht out in the constituencies, and Mr Major is likely to face further trouble on Europe at this year's Tory party conference.
Robin Oakley, thanks very much indeed.